Good afternoon. Welcome to the fourth lecture of the Understanding India series, organized by Paraspar of the Office of Communications, Indian Institute of Science. Today we have Professor Srikumar M. Menon, who will be speaking on the megaliths, missiles from the silent period of history. To give you a brief introduction of Professor Menon, Dr. Srikumar M. Menon is an architect specializing in ancient and early architecture of the Indian subcontinent. Srikumar's academic interests focus on ancient architecture, prehistoric monuments, as well as later monuments such as stupas and temples. His PhD investigated Indian megaliths for possible international astronomical alignment, and he was awarded the Professor B.S. Achyuta Rao Memorial History Research Fellowship for the same in 2007. Subsequently, he was also awarded the Homi Bhabha Fellowship for studying ancient landscape of South India. Under this project, he has studied the sites of Malaprabha Valley, Hampi Higher Venakal region, and this Sanati Shrival region, all in northern Karnataka, leading to deep insights about the continuity of commemorative traditions from prehistoric to later times, and the influence of prehistoric architecture on later monuments. He is the author of two books, Ancient Stone Riddles, Megaliths of Indian Subcontinent, and Comets, Nomads of Solar System, both published by Manipal University Press. Currently, Srikumar is engaged in efforts to understand evolution of principles of construction and stone working in early temple architecture and the practice of architecture in early historic to medieval period in India, including tracking early artisans of ancient India. We're very happy to have you, Professor Menon, and we welcome you to the lecture.
Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen and we'll get started. Okay, is the screen, am I audible first of all to everybody?
Yeah, you're audible and the slides are fine.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much. Yeah, so I'll start it off. Thank you for the introduction. Yeah, today I will be talking about a lesser known aspects of Indian monumental architecture, you could say, because we are very familiar with the tons of examples of Indian ancient Indian architecture, which is mainly temples and stupas and all those monuments which we are very familiar with in our day-to-day experience of our built heritage. But there are also monuments which look something like this, what you see in the picture, which is a monument from this place called Krishnagiri, Mallasandra near Krishnagiri. So these are called megaliths. And today what I'll try to do in the talk is that give you a brief introduction of what megaliths are. And then I'll try to show how whether they have had any influence in the later architectural traditions in the country. Okay, so we'll start off with a quote from this is one of my favorite quotes, which I keep using in all my talks. It sounds rather obvious, like the landscape we live in is a constructed environment rich with the memories of earlier people and events. It looks like Colin Renfrew, this famous prehistorian, is merely stating the obvious. But I hope that by the end of this talk, you'll be able to understand that the levels of meaning which this simple little statement has when we look at later architecture, and we can see the imprints left by earlier, very less known megalithic monuments and all in those. We'll start a journey from Hampi. I'm sure many of you have been to Hampi and you've seen what a spectacular sight it is. So you have this region on the banks of the Tungabhadra where you have a large number of monuments. And I mean, this one is, for example, the Vithala temple towards the north of the site. Okay, and this is one of the later monuments which happened during the rule of the Vijayanagara Empire. And there are many temple complexes like this in the site. So it's a very rightly it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And what is impressive is that any of these monuments, if you see it in any other place, would be a tourist attraction or whatever, something a point of attraction by itself. But the sheer number of such monuments gathered together in a relatively a smaller space is what makes it very impressive. And the monument is scattered in a very dramatic landscape, like you can see here. This is near the Narasimha temple on the banks of Tungabhadra. So the landscape itself is quite dramatic with these huge granite boulders which are kind of piled up in untidy heaps or whatever. And you have the monuments like this which you can see scattered in between these things here. And this is a very familiar sight to anybody who's familiar with any of the architectural heritage in India, especially southern India. But what many of us don't know is that if you travel, let's say 2 or 3 hill ranges to the north of Hampi, you come with an equally impressive site, which is something like this. It's called a Hirabenkal. Okay, this is near the nearest village is Hirabenkal. That's why it is called Hirabenkal. So the actual site is called Moriara Gudde, which means the hill of the Morias, which are supposed to be a dwarf race which went extinct in the mythology of the region. Okay, so here you can see the monuments are not that architecturally evolved as you see in Hampi or whatever, but these are very old monuments. These are probably upwards of 3,000 years ago that they were built. And you see that a large number of these, they are megaliths, particularly a megalithic type known as the dolmen. I will explain that in a little while. So you have more than 75 of these large dolmens which are scattered around in this. Once again, the landscape is very much similar. We have large granite boulders scattered around there. And these monuments are built of the same granite also. What you're seeing here, these monuments built of the stone slabs have been quarried from the same boulders which have been lying around, the granite that you can see piled up here. So there are, like I told you, there are a large number of these monuments. The most spectacular of them are these dolmens, which are large chambers which are built by, making a enclosure covered by 4 upright slabs, and on top of it you put a heavier capstone, as it is called, on top of it to create a chamber within. And many of them have circular holes, which are called portholes, which lead to lead to the chamber inside. But all the monuments in Hirabenkal are not this spectacular. A large number of them look like these, okay, which are you could call them crude dolmens. Okay, there's a term called irregular polygonal chamber. I will not use that for the current talk. I'll use the word crude dolmen for these. So this, as you can see here, is just a large slab of stone which has been propped up on tiny boulders to create a kind of a very shallow enclosure within. Some of them are a little bit more evolved than this. What you can see here, you can see that this monument, for example, there's a large capstone which has been raised on 4 or 3 smaller rocks or whatever. And all these stone cobbles that you can see here, at one point of time, they were used to plug the sides of these openings. So that it will be plugged on all sides except for one point, which will be the entry kind of a thing within that. And archaeologists believe that these were funerary or commemorative monuments in which you would place the remains of dead people within urns or just like that and all that. But of course, none of those remain right now because this has been plundered by a lot of treasure seekers who believe that there would be treasure kept inside these monuments. So the entire site is kind of vandalized currently, but you can see that even though these monuments are very small and dilapidated in the current condition, the sheer number of it changes the landscape in a way that the entire hillside is transformed because you see clusters of these monuments which are small and big distributed all along the hillside. And on this part of the picture, you can see where the bedrock has been quarried away. Mostly they have been quarried by heaping firewood and so the stone expands and fractures, and those slabs are kind of shaped into these capstones and the other smaller cobbles that plug up the sides and all that. Now, Hirabenkal is a very impressive site, and as of today, we have the good news that UNESCO is considering it to become another World Heritage Site. It's in the shortlist of the sites which have been proposed from India. The 6 sites have been shortlisted, and Hirabenkal is one of them. But we don't have any shortage of impressive sites and megalithic sites included. For example, this place is closer to Bangalore. Just across the border near Krishnagiri, there is a hillside known as Mallasandaram or Mallachandiram, where again you have a large number of dolmens. I think about 174 or something like that have been distributed there. Individual monuments are quite impressive. At the heart of it is the same kind of dolmen that you saw in Hirabenkal, which is basically a chamber made of 4 upright slabs and covered by a capstone and with a small porthole, okay, through which probably it is surmised that people used to insert votive offerings during significant dates or whatever to the ancestors who were commemorated with him. Now, in this case, the only thing is that they've got this very impressive stone slab which have been shaped in like a curve at the top, and standing around it. This site is also heavily vandalized. You can see the amount of stone cobble. All of them were heaped up like this around, in these gaps between the outer and inner slabs, but they have all been thrown away now by treasure seekers. Yeah. So here too, all the monuments are not very impressive. In an adjoining hilltop called Etrapalli, you have these crude dolmens like you saw in Hirabankal and some Hirabankal, everything is in one side. Here, all the big dolmens are on one hill and smaller dolmens are on another hill. This place called Etrapalli. In fact, some of the megaliths are not impressive at all. They're not mega at all, like these. For example, the top one you see in Etrapalli is basically just a smallish stone slab which has been raised by a couple of tiny pebble-like things which have been inserted there. But this is not an accidental thing, one-off thing, because even if you go to Aihole, there is a Aihole in North Karnataka, there is a megalithic site there in Meguti Hill, where again you see similar kind of monuments. So ultimately, the question comes about is that what exactly is a megalith? Okay, so megalith, if you look at the terminology, what the word meaning is, it basically refers to mega or megathos. It comes from megathos, which means the scale or the magnitude, which is large, and lithoi, which is basically the material, the stone, which has been used. So basically, megalith means built of large stones. Now today we know that definitely by looking at monuments like this, that in this case the mega part doesn't apply because they're tiny pieces of stone. And in certain cases, like I will show you in the case of Kerala, you don't even have a lithic appendage. Like you don't even have a stone. It may be built out of earth also. But because of a certain way of the way it was classified historically, the term megalith still holds when discussing about these kind of monuments. So what megaliths basically are, they are funerary and other monuments of prehistoric cultures. Now, the important thing to understand here is that when we say megalithic, it is not a period. It doesn't say talk about a period of time, but it means a cultural practice of erecting these megalithic monuments. And depending on which part of the world you're talking about, it occurred at a different stage of human development, different phase of human development in those places. For example, in Europe, like the example that you can see here at Karnak, and and in Scotland. So Callanish in Scotland, you can see that they were erected during the Neolithic, which is the later part of the Stone Age, the New Stone Age or the Late Stone Age, and in the Bronze Age is there. Whereas if you look at India, these monuments seem to have been very popular during the Iron Age and in the succeeding early historic period. So megaliths are not confined to India or Europe alone. They're found all over the world, in most places of the world rather. So you can see some of these examples from Russia and Scotland and France and Ireland. And in India, the very first megalith was reported way back in 1823 by somebody called Babington. And in the nearly 200 years that have elapsed after that, we now know about more than 3,000 megalithic sites all over, mostly in South India, but not confined to South India alone. So if you excavate or you dig up a South Indian megalith, you would find usually secondary burials. Usually the entire body is not buried. After the primary burial, only the skull and long bones are usually removed and inserted into a megalithic burial, and multiple individuals are seen buried in the same megalith usually. And there's a typical pottery fabric which is known as the black and red ware, which is associated with the megalithic burials, and a large number of them. But I want to stress that not all of them. A large number of them contain iron objects, which has led to this association between the Iron Age and the megalithic period in India, megalithic culture in India. So it's very common to say that Iron Age and early historic megalithic period, people talk like that very often. But I personally feel that the megaliths originated in the Neolithic in India too, and then became more popular, widespread during the Iron Age. So just to give you a kind of a handle of what kind of time scale we are talking about, in South India, the Neolithic, which is when agriculture started, for example, and the domestication of animals started, it happened around 3000 to 1200 BC in South India, and followed by the Iron Age, which lasts up to 500 BC, and another 1000 years after that, you find the early historic period, where, for example, scripts started coming in. So you have written records from the early historic period. But the period before that is either prehistoric, where you don't have a script, or proto-historic, where there is a script which you cannot read. These timeline is not watertight by any means of any stretch of imagination. It's just to give you a kind of a time handle when we talk about megaliths originated in the Neolithic and probably spread widely in the Iron Age and the later early historic period. So I think I'll skip these couple of slides which are talking about different practices during the Neolithic and later period. Yes, now we come to where exactly we find the megaliths. Now this one is still 1999. Robert Brubaker had made a plot of where the megalithic sites known till then were distributed, and you can find that largely they are confined to southern India. There are pockets otherwise. Vidarbha in Maharashtra has a pocket. You have in Jharkhand. You have in Kashmir Valley, for example. Okay, and of course, I'm not including the megaliths of the northeast, which where it's even a continuing tradition. It has not been told in this, shown in this particular plot. But you can find that a large, it's very popular to find megalithic monuments in southern India. So just to kind of sum up what archaeologists believe about megaliths and the people who built them, what you find is that during the Neolithic, which is the late Stone Age, like I told you, and the Chalcolithic, which is the Copper Age, they're kind of simultaneous in southern India. You have pit and urn burials. Okay, so you have pit burials in which the remains are placed directly in an unlined pit, and there are urn burials and the remains are placed inside a terracotta urn and buried inside either a pit or inside a stone-lined burial called a cist burial. But usually these are within the settlement and sometimes even inside the very house in which the dead person lived in. Whereas in the Iron Age, you find that there is a emergence of a graveyard, a separate graveyard, which is away from the settlement area, and there are a lot of variety in the stone markers that are used to mark the burial. But below the surface, the old traditions continue. The urn and pit burials continue, which kind of implies gradual change, and that the thing was the development was indigenous, is what it seems to suggest. And if you look at the remains inside the megaliths, you find that everybody who lived in that period did not end up inside a megalith. They only certain people were buried, which is pointing towards the emergence of class probably in during the Iron Age and later periods. Also, the period, like I told you, was about 1500 BC to early centuries of the Common Era. And but I should stress that this chronology is not very well understood because all the megalithic sites we know, the 3000 and odd megalithic sites, all of them are not dated. We have absolute dates only for very few of them. And some of these large and extensive sites like Hirabanikal probably were existed over a large swatch of time, which also we don't have much idea about. Hirabanikal, for example, we do not have absolute dates for that. So the economy during that time were they were either agriculturalists or pastoralists, and these are the crops which were there are evidence for growing them from what you find inside the uh, burials and all that. And cattle pastoralism prevailed over sheep and pastoralism, and you have evidence for blacksmithery, carpentry, and all that. And there was a barter system in place there. Okay, so if you look at the megaliths, they're very diverse. Like I was telling you, the surface markers are very diverse. On the left, you have these two type of burials which are quite endemic to Kerala. First one is called a Kodakkal or the umbrella stone, in which there are these four. It's actually a kind of a because the stone available in those parts of Kerala is not granite or stones like that. You have these laterite, porous, soft porous rock called laterite there, which cannot be shaped into the thin slabs like you saw in Hirabanikal. So it is a kind of an adaptation of the dolmen concept to this. You have a heavy capstone, which is hemispherical almost, and then you have this inclined thing. The vertical sides of a dolmen are called orthostat. In this case, you have a clinostat. You have four clinostats which are supporting the capstone above. And in certain cases, you have rock cut burial, where the chamber is made by scooping out rectangular enclosures within the soft porous rock. So these things are found in, this is found only in Kerala. This is found in Kerala as well as in adjoining South Canara, part of Karnataka. And megaliths could be just a simple erect stone like this, which is in a place called Nilaskal, which is called a menhir. Or usually menhirs are not just one stone alone. They're usually in groups which are in a particular kind of layout. So in a place called Hanamsagar in northern Karnataka, you have what is called a avenue or a stone alignment, which consisted of about 2,500 stones or upwards of that arranged in a staggered grid. Unfortunately, this site recently has been totally wiped out by people who have got the land for agriculture. They've removed it using earth movers and all that. So unfortunately, this site, even before we survey it properly, is lost to us today. And then you have this dolmens like we saw in Hirabanikal, that was made in a particular kind of way. This dolmen in Meguti Hill in Karnataka, which we will encounter close in a little while, is constructed in a slightly different way. I'll not go into the details of that. We will look at it when we come to the part on when we look at Malaprabha Valley in detail. So what I'll do now, this is a sort of an introduction to megaliths. So what I'll do now is expound on some of little bit of my own work, where I try to find if there are any sort of linkages between these prehistoric monuments and later monuments which came up in parts of South India. So we will go for that to this place called the Malaprabha Valley, which has these famous sites called Badami, Pattadakal, and Aihole, which many of you might be familiar with. Put together, they are called the cradle of Indian temple architecture, which is actually not true because temples that started to be built even before that. But these are some of the earliest stone temples that you will find in southern India, and I'll mention a little bit about it when we go along there. So Malaprabha River originates on the eastern flanks of the Western Ghats at a place called Karnakumbi in again North Karnataka, and then flows down till it meets the river Krishna at the place called Kudala Sangama. But before Kudal Sangama, for about 20 kilometers or so, the river runs through a valley between sandstone outcrops. This valley, you can just see Malaprabha going like this here. So this valley is called the Malaprabha Valley, obviously, and it's about 8 to 10 kilometers at its widest, and it's surrounded by sandstone hillocks on either side. So you have this famous site just before the river enters the valley. To the north of it, you have the famous site of Badami, which was the seat of the early Chalukyan Empire, from middle of 6th century to about mid 8th century AD. And then you have Pattadakal, which is again a UNESCO World Heritage Site for the cluster of temples that it has. And where the river exits the valley, you have Aihole. If you look at Badami, in mid 6th century, the first major Chalukyan ruler called Pulakeshi I, he came to this horseshoe-shaped ring of what do you call sandstone cliffs, and he created a bund on the western side, which made this reservoir, all the the rainwater runoff from here created this place called Agastya Tirtha. And if you go to the cliffs on the east of it and look westwards, this is what you would see. So all your famous cave temples of Badami are on the southern part of the cliffs or whatever. And the structural temples, some of the earliest temples in southern India, are on this what is called the North Fort here. And this is Agastya Tirtha. So this is another view of Badami, view of the North Fort from the south. But before the Chalukyan Empire started building these spectacular monuments of whatever, had been living here. Humans have been living here in this place for centuries before that. And it's assumed that it is understood that even the Paleolithic period, this part called Sidlafadi, which is to the outskirts of Badami, to the eastern part, you have a cirque of little cliffs here and rock shelters, which was in continuous use from the Paleolithic period to even to the early historic period. So there is this natural arch of sandstone on the surface of which you can see rock art from various periods in history. You find Paleolithic rock art here. You find even early historic rock art here. You have inscriptions in Shankalipi, which is a undeciphered script also, which you find in this rock shelter. So again, around Badami, you have this place called Ranganatha Gudda. This is as you're leaving Badami on your way to Banashankari, you will find this huge, huge cliff of sandstone, where Mesolithic man, which is Mesolithic is the Middle Stone Age, which could be anywhere from 10,000 to 25,000 years ago, had created this rock art. If you look at it closely, you can see two human figures dancing, drawn in the typical Malaprabha Valley style. This is also repeated in many other rock art sites. And near them is a bunch of wild boars. Presumably, it's the prey species which they are hunting or whatever. And so you have evidence for human occupation of the Malaprabha Valley from really early periods. And you also have a rich tradition of megalith building, much before the Chalukyans started creating monuments in stone. So here, interestingly, this is near a place called Mahakuta, near Badami. And you have a temple here, but in the cliff that is behind the temple, this temple is called the Hiremakuteshwara temple. And behind that, you have rock art again, which you see here. So this kind of tells you that statement of Renfrew that, wherever you look around, you find layers of evidence for the occupation of the place from different periods or whatever. So apart from these temples, I won't be showing you some of the very important monuments of Badami, because this is not a talk about temple architecture. But I'm trying to build up a case for showing that at least some of these temples were commemorative in nature. So this is a place at the cliffs to the east of Badami, a place called Aralatirtha. So if you just go in from the front here, there are these two little shrines which you can see here, single cell shrines. But if you go in here and look inside, there is a natural rock pool which is surrounded by a natural weathering feature into which a lot of Hindu divinities have been carved. Okay, so and again next to this feature called Aralatirtha, you have what is a memorial to a Jain monk. There's no name to this place or whatever, but there's a figure of this Jain monk which is shown here with the triple umbrella carved above, and there are these 2 feet which have been carved, which is the usual way in which memorials are depicted. And here this inscription in 8th century Kannada says that this is a memorial to a Jain Acharya called Vardhamana Deva. We know the name of this guy, and he lived in the 8th century here. If you look from here, you can see that the Badami, the North Fort is so far away. So on the outskirts of the settlement of 8th century settlement, Vardhamanadeva lived and died in this rock shelter, and he is now commemorated in the same shelter where he lived. This is what Google Earth shows us. This is Aralatirtha, which I showed you, and this is a memorial to Vardhamanadeva, which happened in the cliffs to the east of Badami. And I have been working in Badami since 2008, and in many places, I mean, apart from the large monuments that everyone's attention is drawn to, you find a lot of evidence of the practice of commemoration. So in the North Fort, there is this little water pool which is created by quarrying out rocks from there. On the shores of it, you find these padukas or these footprints that you can see out here. And again, you find loose structures like this particular memorial stone, which has been kept, the paduka that you can see here, kept near it's in some place in the North Fort. And then this loose piece of sculpture, which is actually a votive figure, which is given to a temple or a religious structure like that by the relatives of the person who died. He's shown in in an act of veneration here, and this is usually placed in a temple or in its nearby place. And in this case, it has been found and incorporated in a wall that has been built by the ASI recently. There are other evidences of commemoration too. If you go up these steps here, what you see here, there is this inscription during Chalukyan time, which is called the Kappe Arabatana Shasane, which talks about a valorous person called Kappe Arabata. And archaeologists agree that he must have been a Chalukyan hero, about whom we do not know anything else other than what is told in the inscription here, which is in Sanskrit and Kannada. And also nearby, you have this kind of structure, which is a carving of a temple here with a linga within. I'll show you details of it in the next slide. You can see here, this is the same structure I showed you in the previous slide. So throughout in that area near the Kappe Arabatana Shasane, you have things like this, which are carvings of temple. Is a linga there and a Nandi beside it. Like in this case, a linga and a Nandi, again a linga and a Nandi, or standing Vishnu figures, which you can see here. So earlier it has been assumed that these were blueprints by the architects for creating the temples. But my research has shown here that these are actually commemorative structures. Like this particular temple is a commemorative temple for a person who passed away. Similarly, for people who couldn't afford the means of whatever, you have smaller structures which can be seen here as carvings of temples rather than actual temples. And these are also not unknown in the world of heritage. So in Tamil Nadu, near Madurai, there's a temple called, a site called Samanar Male, which is the hill of the Shramanas or monks rather than. So Jain monks have a lot of figures like this carved onto a rock here. And there are inscriptions in Vatteluthu, which Tamil inscriptions, one of which talks about a monk who died in snakebite being commemorated and all that. And also in Shravanbelgola in Karnataka, these two images on the bottom, what you're seeing out here, are again commemorative steles or commemorative figures which are in the Jain tradition. the person being commemorated is shown with his Tirthankara, or in this case Bahubali or Gombata, whom he venerates, along with his Acharya is shown here. And the sun and moon symbols which are carved here are very typical of commemorative stone, that it kind of implies that as long as the sun and moon exist, the memory of the person being commemorated will persist. So, and suspiciously commemorative looking structures are also found on the banks of Tunga at Sringeri. We'll just move on to, now moving down river to Pattadakal, where the river takes a auspicious turn to the north, and that is why this particular place was chosen as a site for locating all the temples. So here you have, the cluster, the big cluster of temples which are known as, which are currently in the UNESCO World Heritage list or whatever. But apart from that, Pattadakal has also got, megaliths in a nearby place called Bachanagudda. Then Bachanagudda is the name of this hill that you can see out here. And near Bachanagudda, there are two megaliths. So there is one megalith which is made of sandstone. It's called a passage grave, which you can see here. There's also another one which is built of granite. It's a bit more elaborate, but it has been vandalized again by treasure hunters long ago. So if you go inside this megalith and you peep out, this is what you will see. You see that on the shoulder of the hill, not on its summit, but on the shoulder, exactly in alignment with it, in the later period, Rashtrakuta temple has been created here. So I suspect that this temple also is commemorative. There are reasons which I will explain in a while when we move on here. There's only a linga within this and a porch which has been destroyed currently. So these are simple temples in which you have a chamber in which the idol is kept, and outside that there's a porch in which an entry is there. It is almost similar to this dolmen that you see here, where there's an inner chamber and then an outer passage, which in this case has been destroyed. So if you go to the top of the hill and look down, you will see this the dolmen that I've been talking about here. This is taken from near the temple, looking towards the dolmen. And this region, this area in between, which is totally under cultivation now, even today, if you dig there, you will find ash, you will find fragments of human bones. So Professor Sundara, who is an archaeologist who has worked extensively in this region and extensively on megaliths and who is an authority on megaliths, believes that these two dolmens are only the remainder of what must have been a vast cluster of dolmens, which you can see, which you could have seen here in the distant past. So if you go closer to the dolmen, you find that it's a little evolved dolmen, this one. They have carved, if you stand on top of the capstone and look, you can see these cup marks or the cup-shaped depressions all along the periphery of the capstone. And if the light is right, you can see how that an element of decoration has been incorporated into this dolmen here. And there is another place near Pattadakal, which is called Huligammana Kolla, which is currently the Huligamma is a goddess who is worshipped there, but it's a rock shelter. And if you go close by, you can see this beautiful array of Saptamatrikas which have been carved during the Chalukyan period. And there's also the Trimurtis which have been carved here. And but in front of the rock shelter, there are many little temples. This one is in the, these are all Chalukyan period temples. And I suspect that this is a sepulchral temple. Note that I'm not even using the word commemorative. This is sepulchral, which means that probably the remains of the dead person are buried below this temple. There's a reason to think that also. There's another temple in the same complex, which you can see here. It looks very unfinished and rather ungainly. But here on the side of it, there is an inscription, again an 8th century Kannada script, which talks about this temple being the heavenward vehicle of Karandiga, is the word they actually use, casket or whatever, of a person, which has been interpreted by different epigraphers as that of the penultimate Chalukyan king, Vikramaditya II. Or some people say it cannot be that, but nobody is in disagreement about the fact that this is a sepulchral temple. Okay, so this site has got a lot of connotations with death. Just a little bit, if you go to the right of this temple and into the woods a little bit, you see this hero stone or memorial stone rather. So you find that it's a typical memorial stone, but carved on a natural boulder, sandstone boulder. So here, this shows the person being commemorated and suggests that he died protecting cattle. Cattle raids were very common in those days. So it's the person who died in a cattle raid is being commemorated for his valorous act here. So if you can see that this is the temple that I was talking about with the inscription, and this is a hero stone here. So put together, this complex has a it certainly feels like a commemorative complex. And from here, let us move on to the main site at Pattadakal. This is a site that tourists go to. This is a site that is inscribed on the World Heritage Monuments list. And people come here because these are some of, like I told you, some of the earliest temples, both in the southern Dravida as well as the northern Nagara tradition. So everyone, myself included, used to look at these temples and wonder at that. But surrounding them, there are scores of little temples that you can see here. If you go close by and look at them, you can see that there are many smaller temples which are seen here. So in 1971, M.S. Mate and Shobhana Gokhale had published a paper called Aihole and Interpretation. This site is Pattadakal, but they talked about Aihole. One question they ask is, why are there so many temples in these parts? And they come up with the conclusion that they are commemorative. They arrive at it from other clues than the ones that I've been using. But they say that this was a tirtha in which people used to set up commemorative structures for the moksha of their relatives or gurus or whatever. So if you look at the temples close by, many of them are so tiny that you cannot go inside and worship or whatever. There's just a linga inside. In this case, the walls have disappeared, so you can see the linga. So there is a Garbhagudi in which there is a linga, and there's a porch in which there's usually a Nandi figure. You can see most of these temples are like this. And this one, for example, really looks like a dolmen with a porthole and a capstone and all. It's carved out of one stone. We have plenty of these structures around. This one also, the way it is put together is very reminiscent of the way dolmens are constructed, the way in which these slabs alternate or whatever. And this again, a couple of these dolmen shrines. So it's quite likely that what we see as a Pattadakal group of temples is one large commemorative site. Again, moving downstream and reaching Aihole, the last site in a trio of sites in the Malaprabha Valley. So this is a view of Aihole. Aihole is a large settlement. It was also the base of a large mercantile guild which operated from here, called the Ayyavale Ainuravaru, the 500 of the Aihole or whatever. So this is the main settlement where you find many of the large temples that you look at. But to the south of it, there is a hill called the Meguti Hill. And on that hill, there's a Jain rock cut cave at the southern end of it. And on the northern end, there is this temple, which is known as the Meguti Temple. It's very special in the study of temples in this area because it's the earliest dated Jain temple, or stone temple rather. In this wall, in the southern wall of this, in the eastern wall of this temple, you have an inscription which is written by this poet called Ravikirti from Pulakeshi II's period. And it's a big prashasti. It praises the Chalukyan Empire, but it also mentions the date in which it was created, which is 634 AD. Okay, so this temple stands inside a walled, fortified compound. But if you go south of the temple and walk towards the Jain rock cut cave, there are plenty of these megalithic monuments which are scattered behind. About 80 of them are there. You can see this. This is the walled compound, the fortified compound in which the Meguti Jain temple is there. And south of it, there are plenty of the dolmen. One of this is close up is shown here. Okay, a sandstone dolmen. So another thing is, if these were prehistoric and the temple came up in the early medieval period, so why would the builders of the temple spare what is actually a ready repository of quarried stones when they're building the temple, or at least even the fort wall when they were building that? So they knew the cultural implications of these monuments, and they respected them. And they probably, maybe even some of them were built even during the temple building period, or at least modified during the temple building period. I'll show you reasons to suspect that in a couple of slides later. So you can see many of these. I'll just run you through the site. It's a wonderful site where you have the temple and the rock cut cave at the southern end. And in between, you have all these megalithic monuments. You can see some of them are very large and impressive, some of them not so much. But some of them are quite complete, as you can see here, these monuments towards the eastern part of the site or whatever. Now, I'll just talk to you about two rather strange dolmens. Now, I'll tell you why they're strange in a while. So there is a dolmen at a place called Montebello. These are photographs taken during the British period, the black and white pictures, which you can see here. And there is another one called the Galaganatha dolmen at Aihole. So this is part of the Galaganatha complex of temples. And you can see the Galaganatha dolmen right here. I'll show you modern pictures of it shortly. So you have Aihole here, you have Meguti Hill, which had the prehistoric sites, and the Jain temple here. And you have these two complex of temples. This is the Galaganatha complex of temples, and this is the Ramalingeshwara complex of temples. So this one is the Ramalingeshwara group of temples. These are the old temples, and this is the new construction which houses the chariot of the temple, the car of the temple there. And this is the Galaganatha group of temples. But behind them, behind one of the temples in the Galaganatha group, you find one of these strange dolmens. It has a capstone which looks like a normal prehistoric dolmen, but it also stands on these 6 pillars or 6 legs of sandstone, which is rather uncommon. Like I showed you, many of the dolmens are built out of solid slabs of stone. You do not have them standing on pillars like this. So this is the historical picture which you can again see here. The dolmen has been spruced up now by the ASI. And this is the Montebello dolmen, which is the only other case. No other dolmen in all the 3,000 sites that we know about stand on legs like this. Okay, so just to put the things in perspective, if you wander around in the on the hilltop behind the Ramalingeshwara group of temples, there are a couple of hero stones. In fact, there are 3 of them embedded in a prehistoric burial known as a cairn. A cairn is a heap of rubble and earth which has been erected to mark a prehistoric burial. And in that same burial, you have got these 3 hero stones which have been erected. And there is also a passage grave in a cairn, again from the megalithic period, when megalith building was being practiced here. And this is all to the south of the Ramalingeshwara group of temples. And then you have a crude dolmen like the ones I showed you in Hirabankal and Etrapalli and all that. There is a big slab of stone which has been just propped up by tinier pieces of rubble or whatever. There are also other temples scattered among the megaliths. In fact, this temple, this west-facing little shrine, is very close to another megalith, which you can see here, one of the crude dolmens or whatever. So there is a question of temples being scattered in a previously existing megalithic site. So why would they do that? Why would people place the temples in a graveyard, which consists mainly of megalithic monuments? So there are also unreported megaliths which are found in this region. This is a megalithic cairn. Of course, the termite hill has grown up later on it. There are other dissipated cairns that you can see here, like this, and you have plenty of those crude megaliths which we are talking about, and you can see the temples of the Galaganatha group in the backdrop. So it looks like you have a parallel of the Meguti Hill case. You have a temple here and you have a temple here. In between, you have plenty of megaliths which have been scattered here. Again, here you have a temple, group of temples here, you have a group of temples here, and you have megaliths actually scattered around the entire region here. Okay, so to understand that, we need to look a little bit closely at the Galaganatha dolmen. So firstly, look at the crude dolmen, which is to the south of the Ramalingeshwara group. The capstone is rather large. It is 3.3 meters in length and roughly 2 meters wide, and about 15 to 33 centimeters thick. And it has been raised on you can see here very clearly, it has been quarried out of the same bedrock here and raised on little boulders there. And if you look at the Galaganatha dolmen, which is on behind that temple that you saw in the Galaganatha group, it stands on these pillars, and its capstone is also similar in size, 3.5 by 2.5 meters and about 15 to 30 centimeters thick. But one thing you will notice here is that the pillars that hold it up have got these wedge marks, which you can see here, this U-shaped depression that you can see here, which is a diagnostic of it having been broken open of the way it was quarried out. I will explain. To understand how it is quarried out in later periods, you have to go to one of the Chalukyan quarries which exist near the Pattadakal group of monuments that you can see here. These quarries are wonderful places. They're very instructive places where you can see how the artisans lived and worked. So you find the sketches from 8th century icons, Ganesha who has been sketched here. There are inscriptions below that. There are masons marks on the rock there. There are what has been interpreted as the attendance marks of the masons, which have been carved on the rock there. There are idols, images, and inscriptions which tell us in 8th century Kannada script again. Much of the rock needed, sandstone, the high quality sandstone needed for the Pattadakal temples have been quarried here. So, for example, you can see this idol. This idol of Durga is in one of the temples, the Papanatha temple in the in Pattadakal, and you can see that the idea for this image was actually carved in the study for the sketch study for that was done at the quarry about 5 kilometers to the north of it. If you go to the quarry and look southward, this is what you will see, the temples. So the stone was quarried where the picture is taken from and taken 5 kilometers southwards, and the temples are built from that. So when you look at how, these are some of the views from the quarry. Okay, you can see Bachanagudda in the distance there. And you can see quarried stones kept ready for transport and all that. And you can see that the wedge marks have been, that the indentations that you can see here on the split stone. And fortunately, there are so many instances of the masons' work in this site that you can understand how they went about doing it. You can see that they used to mark the line along with the stone as to be split, mark out the the wedge points or whatever, and scoop it out like this. And they would put steel wedges in this and hammer them alternately till the stone split along the along the line of wedges or whatever. And when that happens, you get these wedge marks left over on the piece of stone that you find here. And you find that the wedge holes of the Chalukyans are oval in nature, whereas the wedge holes of these are recent illegal quarrying that has been happening in the same site. They are rectangular that you can find here in the later period. So when you look at, I won't bore you with the details, but this is just to show you that I've been looking at all kinds of Chalukyan monuments, and in the unfinished portions of this to find that you have U-shaped wedge marks and oval or lenticular wedge holes that you find in the Chalukyan context. If you look in the later context, like in Hampi and all that, you'll find that this has become rectangular. The wedge holes have become rectangular. So if you see an oval wedge hole, you know that this has been quarried in the Chalukyan period, or the early period rather. So what you can conclude is that the dolmen next to the temple group in the Galaganatha group was something like this, was something like a crude dolmen which existed there. And the temple builders, for reasons that we do not understand right now, raised them on these pillars which have been quarried by them. Okay, so the pillars were made by the temple builders. The dolmen was prehistoric and existed before the temple site was occupied. So that again brings us back to the question: why are there so many temples within a megalithic graveyard in the entire Malaprabha Valley? The reason could be that many of these temples, or probably all of them, okay, were also commemorative in nature, because you have many of the little temples. Some of these look actually like dolmens in this. The way the porch has been fitted out with this entry point here, and a shrine with a linga within that. Okay, so there are other examples which other people have also surmised about. This is one of the earliest constructions in Aihole. It's called the Rawalfadi Cave Temple, and it is scooped out of the rock. And Carol Bollen, in the studies in the 1970s, has said that this particular site was selected for the Rawalfadi thing because this fold of rock here makes it looks like a capstone, and this looks like a porthole dolmen or whatever. So however much truth is there in that, you cannot deny that these rocks above, when you look at it, seem to have been modified to look like some of those crude dolmens that will create chambers within that you can see here, where they might have been, burial goods might have been placed. So there is a lot of the megalithic spirit in many of the later constructions in this period. And the idea of funerary temples or memorial temples are not unheard of in whether in the Hindu context or in the Jain context. So this is Sringeri in southern Karnataka, and in Sringeri, within the temple complex, between the Vidya Shankara temple and the Sharadamba temple, you have again these tiny shrines which you can see here, which have got a Garbhagudi and a porch, and we know that they are the memorials of the various Shankaracharyas who were heading the Sharda Pita here in Sringeri. And so you know that this commemorated a particular Acharya, this commemorated another Acharya and all that. And again, outside the temple complex there is a Jain temple, which you can see here, which has an inscription which says that this temple was built to commemorate a Jain trader called Mari Shetty. So we have known instances of memorial temples within the the holy sacred ground, so to say, of the temple at Sringeri. And there are also many similar looking temples outside in the settlement, which could have been, I mean, this is not, we don't have any inscription proving it, but which could have been commemorating lay persons, not the clergy, but the lay persons of the faith. Okay. Now, that was just to tell you about the linkages between megalithic monuments and temples in various contexts or whatever. No, I just want to take some time out to tell you about the stupa, which is again another later monument, which happened after the age of the megaliths. So some of my recent work seem to suggest that the stupa also derives its form, not just the function, but also the form from the humble megalithic kind which was there before it. So we'll go to Krishnagiri, the Mallasandram side, which I showed you about some time back. So this is a Google Earth view of Mallasandram. The dolmens are large enough that they turn up in the, you can see these are all clusters of dolmens that you see here. So there is a cluster here, there's a cluster in the center, and there's a cluster in the western part of the mountain, or the sheet rock of the mountain. And this is how one of these clusters looks like. This is a cluster in the middle cluster, how it looks like from the cluster on the east. And this site too, unfortunately, is being because many of these sites are very remote. Hardly anybody goes there except the treasure hunters. This was in 2014 end. I had visited the site, and just a day previously, somebody had excavated the vandalized the dolmen rather, to find whether they find any gold or anything in the urns there. These are the pottery that turned up. Nothing had gold or anything. They probably had only ash and fragments of human bones and offerings. You know, there's certain offerings of grain and all that, which the husk of which we can still find inside this offering pots. So this is one sad reality in most of our megalithic sites. We're losing this heritage, which most of us don't even know that exists there. Anyway, the parallels between Hirabenikal and Mallasandram are stunning. First of all, both of them are granite. The dolmens are of the same size. There is a pool to collect rainwater. Probably water played some part in the ceremonies, death ceremonies which are being enacted out at this site. So you have a pool like that in the central group in Hirabenikal, and you find that happening in Mallasandram also. And in fact, if I take away the labels, even a person familiar with the site will find it very difficult to tell whether the picture is taken in Mallasandram or Hirabenikal. In this place, I want to take you to one particular dolmen, which you can see here, which I've outlined here. You can see that there's a circular outline visible. It's a very large thing, about 10 meters in diameter, in the Google Earth view itself. And if you look at it closely, this is how it looks like. Okay, there is a dolmen at the center, and the capstone is missing, of course. And all around it, there's a closely fitted ring of stone slabs which go across like that. Okay. And inside that, you have, in fact, to prevent the stones from collapsing outwards, you have a little retaining wall-like structure which has been built around that. And rubble has been heaped up, from these stone slabs all the way to the top of, which you can see in only this one segment, it is complete. In all the rest, people have been digging it out, looking for gold. And so this is a detailed view of how the stone slabs have been put in a ring around the thing. And if you look at it from outside, you have a sort of a cylinder. And from there is a little shallow dome-like thing which rises to the central point, which is the megalith here. The closer view of the retaining wall structure, which has been kept to keep it in position. So I made a measure drawing of the thing and how it would look like when it was complete. Now what you're seeing here looks just like a stupa, where you have the drum of the stupa and the dome of the stupa. So form-wise, it looks very similar. And of course, a stupa is nothing but a reliquary. It holds the relics. The memorial stupas hold the relics either of the Buddha or venerable monks in the order. And usually, in some cases, if you look at some of the stupas, like the ones that I forget where exactly there are the reliquary. The relic casket is placed inside a reliquary, which actually looks like the way a dolmen or a cyst is constructed. So this is not my speculation. People have been speculating for a long time because that stupas have evolved from the megalithic kind. But this particular monument, what you see here, is a stupa megalith, you could call it. You know, it's a transitionary thing in between evolving into a full-blown stupa and the kind which is just a heap of structures or whatever. So I have done some work in which it looks like, and this is not just one particular monument. This is one large monument, but there are also smaller ones like this around at Mallasandram. So if you look at kinds which are just heaps of rubble, like I was telling you, they're burial monuments marked by a heap of rubble or earth mixed with rubble. So if you look at small kinds, like this is a place called Buddhana Jaddu near Udupi. it is a laterite cairn where chunks of laterite have been heaped in a shallow dome kind of formation. And if your dome, if your what do you call cairn is very small, like 2 meters in diameter, it can hold its form over large periods of time. But if your cairn wants to be bigger, like let's say 20-meter diameter in this case in Champa in Vidarbha region in Maharashtra, then by gravity itself the cairn will tend to dissipate. So then what happens is that people put large boulders in a circle around it to contain the material of the cairn to make sure it doesn't dissipate. And what happens when you have to build a taller cairn, higher cairn rather, then you need to you need to drive in stone slabs like this at an angle into the ground. Okay, so it's like a circular stone slab driven into the ground on which you heap rubble so that it can become a more prominent monument. And just a moment. Yeah. So basically, what's happening is, I'm sorry to put this very unromantic looking picture here of a construction site in somewhere in Manipal. So when you put in construction material like a heap of sand or whatever, you put a circle of things to contain it. Okay, it's just a structural requirement. So when you have a small cairn, it can retain its shape over a large period of time. When you want to make it larger, you need to surround it with boulders or whatever. And when you want to make it higher and more prominent, you probably need to contain it with slabs which are driven into the ground so that they can hold it properly. And from there, it's only one step away to the stupa dolmen that you saw in Mallasandram, and then to a full-blown stupa like this. So this is one of the lesser-known Buddhist stupas at a place called Kanaganahalli in northern Karnataka, where I was fortunate enough to work in that place for 4 years on and off. So this is a stupa which dates back, the core of it dates back to the Mauryan period, and in subsequent period, the Shatavahanas and various people have been embellishing it. So stupas like this have evolved from a humble megalithic cairn that you can see in the inset here. So how do stupas look like? So this is again the Sannati stupa that you can see here. So stupas usually have what you see here is the dome of this thing has collapsed, and it was only excavated in the 1990s. And then so you have the drum. In this case, and the drum is in two levels. There's the lower drum and an upper drum, above which the dome of the stupa would have been extended here. So the drum is a very nice place on which you can put sculptured slabs here, like this, for example. This is Muchilinda, the Nagaraja who sheltered the Buddha when he was sitting in meditation, when he got enlightened. So the drum lends itself to a lot of imagery that in the evolved stupa you find things happening like that. So this one is the Dharma Chakra that you can see here. Here you can see the story of the Buddha setting forth on his renunciation. You can see the Buddha's horse Kantaka going forth. In that period, in the Theravada Buddhism, you do not have the Buddha represented as a human being. So you cannot see a rider on the horse, but the parasol which is being held over the horse shows the presence of the Buddha here. And then you can see the horse and the groom coming back after leaving Buddha in the forest. And this place is also important because it has a image which of a king here with his queen and surrounded by his attendants. And we know the name of the king because it is engraved in Brahmi Lipi. It says Rayo Ashoko. So this is Ashoka, the king that you're seeing here. It's the only inscribed portrait of the emperor ever found anywhere, where he's referred to as Ashoka. So what I'm trying to say is that stupas became very spectacular monuments, all over the subcontinent. But it's quite possible that this kind of structures evolved from the humble megalithic structure that you see, like at Hirabanikal and all that. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for listening to me. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Menon. That was a very, very insightful presentation. Yeah, we'll take some questions. The questions can be typed in the chat box, or you can, unmute yourself and ask the question. There's already a comment which I would like to, read out by Devashish Ghosh. The dolmens in Europe date back to 3,000 to 4,000 years. The ones in India are from 600 AD and look similar to the European dolmen. I'm sure there is no connection, but they are similar. Their similarity, especially with one standing on vertical legs, is striking.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. Actually, I would say there's a question that has not been sufficiently addressed in recent times. I'll come to why it is like that. one thing I would like to correct in your thing is that it is not from 600 AD. We have dates for dolmens, megaliths rather, dating back to even to Kathleen. There's one slide I missed out in this presentation where it one of the Brahmagiri charcoal samples dates to 2500 BC. Okay, so that is well into the Neolithic. So I suspect, and also the very fact that though our dolmens are in the Iron Age and later periods, you do not find wedge marks pointing out to steel used in extraction and all that. There are many reasons why we think that in India too, megaliths started off at least in 2500 BC or whatever, but it became more popular in the later periods. That is for sure. Okay, but coming to the question of why they look similar, that's very interesting because early on people used to think that there was this diffusion theory where megaliths originate in one part of the world and then through migrations of people or migrations of ideas, they move across the globe. But currently that is not very fashionable among the, among the archaeological community. They believe that people can independently come up with a similar kind of forms, even though they do not have prior exposure to it. It's because of the way the human brain is built, is what they argue. Okay, but I don't think that might be completely true. I think this is a question that we would do well to revisit. And I think that we need to look at why there's some striking similarities in form in megalithic monuments separated over large distances. I think there still might be something to unravel there. Thank you. It's a good question.
Sukumar, could you please unmute yourself and ask the question?
Thank you very much, Dr. Menon, for your very interesting talk. I'm Sukumar from Ecological Sciences at IISc. I work on ecology and
I'm not able to hear you properly.
I work on the ecology of the Nilgiri Hills. Hello?
We are not able to hear you properly.
Okay, I'm out in the field. Maybe I'll type it in the chat box.
Yeah, that would be okay. The last bit was clear though.
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me? Therefore my connection is not so good perhaps. If you go to the highest elevations of the Nilgiris, which is more than 2000 meters, you get megaliths, including dolmens and cairns and barrows and so on. And what is that although people have studied the megaliths at lower elevations, 1000 meters in the Deccan Plateau or below, nobody seems to know anything much about the origin and the dating of these megaliths at the highest elevations of the Western Ghats. And that's interesting from an ecological viewpoint because that's something about when humans first occupied the highest elevation. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that, Dr. Menon.
It's a region which I'm not so familiar with. Thank you. It's a very nice question because it's something that I'm quite keen to follow up on at some point of time. I've been looking at megaliths in the in Marayur, Munnar region of the Western Ghats. Okay, so there you find there are distinctly different types of, because there are certain things which are that Marayur Palani region have got a very distinctive form for the megaliths, and they're quite different from what you see in other places. They're similar to passage graves and all, but they've got an architecture which is very distinctly of their own, and I don't think that has also been dated very well to that. So I'm very keen to diversify and look at the megaliths of the Nilgiris too. From what I've seen in the literature and the pictures there, they look a little bit very different from the, quite different, not a little bit, quite different from the ones that you see elsewhere, like the ones in Marayur and all that. So I really don't know what the dates of that are, but I would be keen to find out.
We'll try and meet up sometime when I come back to them.
That would be lovely. Thank you very much.
There are some comments in the chat box. This is by Professor Anand Balasubramanian of IISc. He says he would like to thank us for organizing this lecture. It tells us what a rich history we have, and the amount of work and understanding of the speaker are remarkable. It is in the true spirit of this series. Congratulations. This is the comment. And there's another one by Gopal. What is the significance of this litho studies in the current scenario? That's the question.
Okay. I mean, I don't know what you mean by the significance of it. Basically, we are just trying to understand how. I am trying to understand how monumental architecture arose in the Indian subcontinent. Though when we talk about the temples and other structures that we normally classify as architecture, they don't have a history much longer than 2,000 years. The oldest temple is not much older than 2,000 years in stone. I would like to add, because they probably were temples in perishable materials which existed before, but they haven't survived. So the oldest surviving temples, which are usually in the lithic medium, are not much more than 2,000 years old, and the stupas will go few centuries before that. But humans have always been making monuments here, and some of these things, in fact, even before megaliths, you find monuments called the ash mounds, which I did not stress about. They're probably the oldest monuments. In the Neolithic, when people started first domesticating cattle and all that, they used to pen the cattle in large circular pens, and the accumulations of dung was set fire to periodically. Initially, it was thought that it is a very quotidian kind of a task, but now a lot of archaeologists, I don't follow the argument exactly, but they feel that this is a ritualistic thing, and these ash mound, which sometimes became the size of small hills, they were the initial monuments of the southern part of India, which subsequently, when the practice of erecting ash mounds tailed off, that is when the practice of erecting megaliths kind of picks up. And so somewhere in the middle of the Neolithic, this happened. The later part of the Neolithic, ash mounds lose their their popularity, and megaliths become very popular. So we are trying to look at how people started building monuments in this part, and what the purpose of building these monuments were. In this case, it was commemoration, and how it evolved to give us this rich body of architecture that we have in the subcontinent today. I hope that answered your question.
He had a rejoinder. He said that application to today's world. That's what he meant. I think that answers the question.
Yeah, okay. I hope it does. Thank you.
So there are some comments. One is by Parveen Banu. She said, thank you for such an informative session. Then there's another one from Rajkumar Rampur. Thank you for the informative session. Then Debashish Ghosh. Thank you, Professor Menon, for the fascinating talk, and thanks to the organizers.
Thank you very much.
Debashish Ghosh has a question. I have another question. From the photographs I have seen, these megalithic structures are found more in the midst of wide open plain rather than in places with lots of trees. Can there be any reason for this?
Okay, I must confess that selection of my pictures might have contributed a little bit to this, because you have megaliths in the forest too. But I have been taking most of these monuments, which you call the dolmens. So dolmens are basically like a box-like structure which are above the surface of the ground. And normally dolmens are erected on rocky hills. So obviously there won't be any trees or anything around. But if you look at the burials which are there in areas with earth in it, so they are called schist burials. In plan, they look very similar to the dolmens, but they're smaller size and they're buried entirely in the ground. And you also have intermediate stages called a dolmenoid schist, where it is half embedded in the ground and half out of the ground. So if I had included more pictures of non-dolmen sites, then you might have seen more vegetation and all that probably. But dolmens are usually built on bedrock, so it will be there won't be vegetation around it.
Chanda Jain-Jo, could you please unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yes, thank you very much for a very fascinating talk. I was just a bit worried that all this treasure is being now lost the way you described it, is being plundered. So can we do anything to save it for posterity?
Yeah, that's I wish I knew the answer to that, because that would be really useful. But yeah, only thing I can think of is that if we can get, if we can get the local there's a parallel in this to people who are involved in wildlife conservation. Okay, how do we arrive at a model of conservation in this case? So what I have found in my experience is that when the locals are proud of it themselves, that's the only way you can help to protect it. Rather than, see, for example, Hirebenakal is a protected site.
Menon, we cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now? Is it better? Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, fine. So yeah,
Yeah, but now I can hear.
Okay, fine. I hope it's audible. So the thing is, like the sites on which I did my PhD is called Nilaskal and Baise. That these two places which are very close to Hosanagara in Karnataka. So there's a small primary school which was built by destroying part of. It's a megalithic stone alignment. There are about 100 megaliths, menhirs, single erect stones which have been distributed over a large area, and I have found some intentional astronomical alignments also in those. So we held some programs in the schools where we got the school children to come there and survey the things with us and understand what is happening in this case. And also the winter solstice sunset framed between the menhirs there is also a very spectacular sight. So we organized programs there, and now the people there are very much involved in the upkeep of the site. And there was also some problem of people digging soil from this megalithic site and all that. All that has been stopped now. So that was just a fortunate, coincidence or whatever. But ideally, because most of these are in remote places, and ASI usually does not have any watchman posted there because they're too numerous. The megalithic sites, like I told you, there are 3,000 and above sites there. So we cannot have this model where you have a watchman in every megalithic site and all that.
Yeah.
So yeah, that it becomes difficult to. It becomes very difficult to protect all these sites. And I myself have seen in these last 15 years a very large number of sites being totally wiped out, and it's very depressing too.
Yeah, that's a real shame. Yeah, it's a very nice idea to involve local people, as you said. And about this Ashoka inscription that you mentioned, I have never heard about it before. So has it been published anywhere?
Yeah, it has been published. Recently, ASI has published the entire excavation report of this stupa. It's a place called Kanaganahalli. So, or Sannati. These are two villages nearby where the stupa was in Kanaganahalli, which is a stupa, in one of the villages, and the habitation site of that period is in the village called Sannati. So it's been quite well documented, and though it's not open to the public yet, because there's some conservation work still going on there. So it's not open to the public, but still, I'm hoping that it will come up soon. There have been some articles published on it. On all the carvings that you find here, Monica Zinn has published a book on just the upper drum slabs of the stupa and all that.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much again for a very informative talk.
Thank you.
There is a comment from Professor Rogini Balakrishnan. Thank you for this absolutely fascinating and informative talk.
Thank you, ma'am.
Does anyone have any other question? If not, then we can wrap up today's session. Okay, I think we'll stop for today. It was very wonderful to have you, Professor Menon, and we hope to hear from you a little bit more regarding the same topic, because we have not done enough. So thank you so much. Thank you once again, and thank you everyone for joining in today.
Thank you for organizing this, and thank you everybody for listening to me. Thank you very much.